This is the East India Company, the corporation that stole a nation. Picture London upon the turn of the 17th century. Francis Drake had completed his expeditions, the Spanish had been defeated, and fewer opponents dared go against the growing British Empire. Spirits were high, especially thanks to the possibilities that lied outwards. Returning travellers told tales of vast riches and natural resources that awaited plunder. One region piqued the interest of Queen Elizabeth I, the Indies. Explorers were ordered to set up trading hubs known as factories across the region, laying the foundation for a state-owned trading company. The Queen granted her charter and a monopoly to a corporation named Governor and Company of Merchants of London trading into the East Indies, later known as the East India Company. The venture in 1600 initially aimed at spicing up the British market. Literally, they were obsessed with spices, especially after learning their true sky-high value. Relations with India was built off this spice trade, continuously developing, leading to opening the gates to a new age of European discovery. This brand new era was perhaps defined by the fierce competition between colonial powers. The Dutch had previously monopolised the spice trade with their Dutch East India Company, not to be confused with the British EIC. The Dutch were by far the richest trading power in the world, pretty much due to getting everywhere before everyone else did, but this was soon to change. The EIC's initial voyages faced the wrath of the high seas and the stiff resistance from the seasoned Portuguese and Dutch. However, it was the first naval victory and capture of the Portuguese ship São Tomé in the Malacca Straits by Sir James Lancaster in 1602 that initiated a British stronghold on the spice trade. Money gained from the seized spices from the carrot allowed them to set up their first factories on the Spice Islands. This successful voyage not only bolstered the EIC's coffers, but also painted a target on its back. Constant skirmishes occurred between the three powers. The Battle of Swally in 1612 resulted in a huge British victory, effectively pushing the Portuguese to the side, allowing them to gain a foothold in India opposition-free. By 1615, the company's first Indian factories had opened in Andhra Pradesh and Surat. Initial high profits impressed King James I, who arranged a commercial treaty with the Mughal Emperor for more factories across India, beginning a long expansion phase. As the ships anchoring on the Indian shores multiplied, the sole focus on spices began to diversify into other industries, notably textiles. The land was an absolute textile treasure trove, and this meant opportunity for the East India Company. Textiles like muslin, calico, and chintz were not only exotic, but also in high demand in Europe, a demand that the EIC was keen on capitalizing. The company started to invest in trading posts and factories across the Indian subcontinent to secure a steady supply of these coveted textiles. This shift had profound economic implications. The influx of Indian textiles started to reshape the economic landscape in Britain. The dependence on Indian textiles spurred industrial innovations back home. The textile mills in Britain began to buzz with the rhythm of the Industrial Revolution, fueled by the technological advancements aimed at replicating the quality and finesse of Indian textiles. By the mid-17th century, the company had 23 factories and settlements in India, with this number increasing year by year, stretching from Madras to Bengal. Over time, customs duties were completely waived for the company, giving them extreme trading power for the region. This period marked the onset of a symbiotic yet exploitative economic relationship, where the Indian textiles filled the British coffers, and in return, the wheels of industrial innovation in Britain began to turn faster, setting up a system of total exploitation and eventual dominance. Having gained some power within the subcontinent, the EIC began its abuse with the relentless drain of wealth from India to the shores of Britain. To put it simply, the EIC destroyed Indian industry, making it so only raw materials could be exported. They then placed heavy tariffs on these raw materials and transported them to the now booming industrial centre of Britain, where manufactured goods would be produced. These expensive goods were exported back to India, making wealth creation and progression near impossible for Indian traders. So essentially, a competitive disadvantage meant that India had to pay a premium on goods they were dependent on, as the means of their own production were destroyed, which bankrupted them in the process. This is exactly how the East India Company did it. The deindustrialization, primarily of the vibrant textile industry, crippled the Indian economy. The thriving textile mills in places like Dhaka and Murshidabad were systematically obliterated, the skilled artisans reduced to penury, and the once booming trade was forced into nothingness. This was mainly done through taxation. Any Indian exports that the British deemed profitable were taxed into oblivion. Heavy duties were levied on textiles which destroyed their competitiveness compared to cheap British imports. The EIC's policies were meticulously crafted to subdue and obliterate India's indigenous industries, transforming the subcontinent from a manufacturing colossus to a mere supplier of raw materials. It was a calculated move to eliminate competition for British goods in India and elsewhere, ensuring a market for domestic industries, basically financing the success of the Industrial Revolution. The loot from India nurtured the City of London and fueled British prosperity. On the other hand, India found itself relegated to the role of agricultural supplier. The agrarian sector was manipulated to serve the interests of the EIC, with Indian farmers coerced into cultivating cash crops like indigo and opium instead of food crops, which led to recurrent famines. By 1850, the agrarian shift had created nearly 1,000 square kilometres of poppy farms in India's fertile Ganges plains. The company's mainstay businesses were by then cotton, silk, indigo dye, saltpeter, and tea. Farms shifted away from food production and more towards these more lucrative products. As a result, the conditions were set for an increased risk of famine and widespread starvation. For example, the Great Bengal Famine of 1770 resulted in the deaths of between 7 to 10 million people, or around a third of the region's population. This was just the one of many to occur during British occupation. But were these famines directly caused by the East India Company? Let's explore this a bit further, because it is complicated. The Battle of Buxar in 1764 between the EIC and Indian forces resulted in British victory. Defeated Indian rulers were forced to sign the Treaty of Allahabad, which gave the company immense economic control. One of the cornerstone policies within this treaty was the permanent settlement policy. This introduced a fixed revenue system where Indian landowners were obligated to remit a hefty portion of the agricultural produce as tax. The onerous tax demands, often up to 50% of the produce, left the peasants in a perpetual state of poverty and indebtedness. The Bengal famine came at a time where the East India Company had been given the right to collect revenue. However, it is argued the main catalyst for widespread starvation was crop failure. It is possible that these tragedies could have happened regardless of administration, but there is no doubt that, for one, the British created the context for worsening agricultural conditions, and two, they did absolutely nothing to prevent or correct the situation. Despite warnings of impending famine-like conditions, the company increased land revenue collections and failed to design any relief plan. When the famine hit, there was no reduction in taxation or any significant relief effort. They knew of the deaths, but due to the unprofitableness of providing relief, correcting it was not in their interest. Money was the only interest, and bleeding India dry of it remained their sole objective. But EIC were far from content with merely capitalizing on the Indian subcontinent's abundant resources. It yearned for control, a desire that soon translated into a more assertive and later aggressive political role, as well as lots and lots of land. Confronting a sharp nosedive of its stock price following huge famine-related revenue losses, the EIC felt the need to acquire land to recuperate losses, as well as further solidify their power over India. The aforementioned revenue collection policy gave them some degree of authority over vast tracts of land. This authority was abused by force and expanded to the extreme. Following victories in the Anglo-Mysore and Anglo-Maratha wars in the late 18th century, the company were left in control of large areas of northwest and south India, with no native threats to their power. They then annexed the northwest provinces in 1801, Delhi in 03, Assam in 28, and Sindh in 43. The Anglo-Sikh wars in the 1850s resulted in the annexation of Punjab, Kashmir, and the northwest frontier province, shortly followed by Berar and Oudh. By the end of EIC rule, the map of India looked something like this, with the red showing British-controlled land. The company's approach was simple yet brutal: usurp fertile lands, manipulate revenue systems to their advantage, and ruthlessly quell any form of resistance that dared to challenge their despotic rule. By controlling the land, and by extension the resources, the EIC could dictate the terms of trade, levy exorbitant taxes, and ensure a continuous flow of wealth from India to Britain. With the destruction of Indian industry complete, they relied on imports of manufactured goods. Where else to look than Great Britain? They had taken the raw materials from India, turned them into manufactured products at home, then returned them to India without tariffs or taxes, dominating the heavily taxed local produce. One good thing that the company did contribute to India was railways. In 1845, 1845, two significant railway companies, the East Indian Railway Company and the Great Indian Peninsula Railway, were formed. Despite facilitating the movement of troops, helping quell rebellions and maintaining an iron fist over the country, they enabled the rapid transport of resources and labour to benefit both the company and the Indian population. But the Indian people were still less than impressed. Discontent riled up, leading to the downfall of the East India Company. Railways inadvertently helped sow the seeds of rebellion, with increased connectivity among states fostering a sense of Indian unity for the first time. The simmering discontent found its spark in the greased cartridge controversy. The company introduced new cartridges for the Enfield rifle, which were rumoured to be greased with pork and beef fat, offensive to both Muslim and Hindu soldiers. This seemingly minor change was perceived as a blatant attempt to undermine the religious identity of Indian soldiers, igniting the flames of rebellion. Not forgetting 150 years of exploitation, the Indian Rebellion of 1857 sparked into life. It transcended military ranks, resonating with the common folk and disgruntled nobility who rallied against the company's rule. Despite the threat, the disciplined, well-armed forces of the company suppressed the rebellion ruthlessly, with towns razed and rebels hanged. While 6,000 British soldiers were killed, it is estimated that up to a staggering 800,000 Indians were killed. The repercussions of the uprising were monumental. The atrocities committed during the suppression garnered the attention of the British Crown, leading to the Government of India Act. The British government had enough of the East India Company, so they nationalised it, taking over its Indian possessions and powers, beginning the era of the British Raj. Now, the UK Crown directly ruled the majority of India and would do so for another 90 years. So this was the end of the East India Company. Their powers had dwindled leading up to the dissolution, with the UK government slowly taking over. Commercial rights and trading monopolies were whittled down one by Parliament throughout the early 1800s, weakening its hold. Decades of mismanagement, cultural insensitivity, and political overreach became its undoing. The East India Company's rule over India left a mixed legacy. They pirouetted from a humble spice trader to India's de facto ruler, amassing immense wealth while draining India's vitality, unfurling the British flag over factories that soon overshadowed palaces. The EIC shifted from peddling spices to peddling influence, destroying native industries, levying ruinous taxes, and commodifying land and labour. Though they laid railway tracks that paradoxically hastened their own downfall by unifying a subjugated people, their legacy remains an indelible stain of exploitation, culminating in a bloody rebellion that prompted their exit. And here's the most bewildering part. The East India Company was not a nation, it was a corporation, a for-profit entity governed by shareholders and motivated purely by profit. It's hard to fathom today how a mere company could rule a vast expanse of territory, dictate terms to emperors and sultans, and exploit millions of lives, all under the banner of trade. So, what can we learn from the East India Company today? In an era where corporations wield enormous power, though not at the EIC's territorial scale, this serves as a cautionary tale of the unchecked corporate influence and the absolute necessity of regulation. Apple, Amazon, and Google may not command armies or levy taxes, but they do hold unparalleled sway over our data, privacy, and in some ways, our governments. If history has taught us anything, it's that immense power concentrated in the hands of a few, be it corporate or sovereign, inevitably leads to exploitation. The story is ultimately a reminder of the human cost of greed, the corrupting influence of unchecked power, and the scars left by economic imperialism that nations still struggle to heal from. So the next time you hear a corporation is getting too big to fail, remember the East India Company, because sometimes the bigger they are, the harder they fall, and the harder they fall, the harder they hit those beneath them on their way down. The British Raj followed the EIC to exert power in perhaps an even more oppressive and tyrannical rule, but that is a whole nother video. If you want to see that, leave a comment down below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.